What's going on, guys? Welcome back to this week's episode of Outside the Arena with Mac and Griff. I'm Griffin Senek, joined by my co-host, Mac Rommel, and today we have a very special guest. He's a fantasy football expert, so with the fantasy football season kind of up and coming now, it's almost that time of the year, so we're very excited today to be joined by a parent Mets fan and Gary Carter, so a Gary Carter fan, so I love that, Jake Ciely.
Well, thanks. Yeah, a fellow Mets fan. I wasn't a Mets fan for a couple of years. I was we're still rooting for the players, but I was hating the organization until they got rid of the Wilpons, and now that they're gone, now I'm back to being a Mets fan again. Had to get rid of the Wilpons.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right. So I guess jumping right into your career as a fantasy expert, it's obviously a very interesting career. You don't really hear of a lot of people going into that field. So how'd you go about becoming a fantasy football expert? And then when did you know that this was something that you wanted to do for a living?
Yeah, so I mean, I've been doing this like most people, playing since
Yeah.
high school, and in college, actually, yeah, late college, might have been like towards the end, but there was a time back when forums were still a thing, fantasy football. There wasn't actually even fantasy football. It was a New York Giants forum, and we used to talk Giants and a lot of stuff in fantasy. And I just started giving out advice because I was doing this on the side. I was really good at it. I always wanted to be in sports, but back with, I don't want to give my weight. Everybody knows I'm a 90s kid. I don't want to give too much away about my age, but I kind of get the sense of like, it wasn't, not only was like doing right what we're doing right now, like video and just going out there and be able to do it, and podcasting and just being able to go out and do it. Also fantasy football, go out there and be able to do it for a living. Like all these things weren't like really conceivable to go do. So it wasn't like go to college and, hey, I want to go into sports journalism, but I also want to head in this direction. I mean, even sports journalism wasn't even really a thing. Like at ODU, I went to Old Dominion. Didn't even really have much. So anyway, long story short is I was on the forums, and one of the guys after a bunch of weeks was just like, dude, why aren't you doing this? And so I started my own blog, and on Blogspot, and started my Blogspot blog. And after about 2 years of doing that, sent it out to anybody and everybody I could find. And thanks to a relationship with Tristan Cockcroft of ESPN, got connected with Scott Angle and started doing it. Now I'm going into my 11th year of actually doing this for a site.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. I mean, I think a lot of people would love to be doing something like that. Obviously, when you're like we are in high school, I mean, it's like that's pretty much all there is to talk about for a good few months of the year. I mean, that's kind of every social interaction I feel like is based around fantasy football. So I guess my next kind of question is obviously, the fantasy football industry, it's not a particularly big one. There's not too many jobs to go around. So how exactly, I mean, obviously you talk about, your connection and whatnot, and now you're working for a site for your 11th year, but I mean, how would you say, it's kind of a narrow industry. So how did it kind of just come about? It seems like that's what you're kind of saying, or like, I guess, how does one land a job per se in this industry?
So I would say it's easier now, but also harder in a way. So like easier now in the fact that I tell people all this time, I've had, your guys aren't the first ones that have ever asked me, like, how did I get into this? And when I was first sending everything out in, the back when I didn't know where to send it, I was sending it to like the talent. Like I would send it, like if I was doing it right now, I would send it to me, and I would send it to like Matthew Berry. But back then I was sending it to Tony Kornheiser and, like Mike Greenberg and Max Kellerman and stuff like that, because I didn't know any better. Don't do that. Tony Kornheiser actually called and yelled at me and said, if you want to just do this, go do it. But that's where I say things are easier these days, because you can, if you want, you can go just start doing this job. If you want to start doing it, you're not going to get paid, obviously, but if you want to get out there and start getting reps to where you can turn it into a career, that's the part that's tougher, because you kind of touched on it. It's not just, again, you're not going to college. You don't go to college and get a degree in fantasy sports. Nobody's doing that. So what I did, and unfortunately, it's not the path that sounds enjoyable, but it depends on how much you want this to be a dream. I spent 6, almost 7 years of doing this for free. I was doing it as a full-time second job. I worked at a regular company out of college for many years. I was an internet marketing manager for many years, and I kept doing this 34 hours a week on the side for free. I eventually started getting $50. I started eventually getting $500 a month. I opened my own deli out, and that is still doing it at the same time. That I don't know how I was doing both at the same time back then. That's why I was miserable, according to my friends. But I say all that to say, you got to decide if you want to be in this industry. You just mentioned it. It's not easy. There's not a lot of jobs. Do you want it to be a part-time fun? Because there are a lot of those. There are a lot of sites starting to pop up, and that's why I say it's easier. You have, Fade the Noise and Establish the Run and Fantasy Points and all these sites that are out there. They'll be like, hey, we'll give you $100 an article. So you could do it. It's not going to make a living off of it, but you need a career, and that's going to be on the side. If you want to get to the point where it's a full-time, that's how you start. But you're going to have to understand that you're going to be doing two things at once to likely get there. Nobody really walks out the door into working in fantasy sports full time, unfortunately. Maybe 5-10 years from now, that's a thing, but right now it's not. So it's really comes down to you. You said, how do you get into it? It comes down to you. And it comes down to having a different voice than everybody else, because there are hundreds and hundreds of people out there trying to do this, trying to say the exact same thing. Like, you guys both know this. Anybody out there talking about CeeDee Lamb right now, nobody's not talking about CeeDee Lamb. But what makes you different in talking about CeeDee Lamb than everybody else? And that's what's going to separate you from everybody else.
Yep. And then I guess going back to what you said, working for 7 years basically on the side for free, how are you able to manage your time? And did you think that you would be put in the position you are in right now today from doing that for free for so long?
So I'd always hoped, I expected, but I wouldn't say if it never happened, I wouldn't have been surprised just because of how tough it is. So the managing the time just came to the fact that, look, I went to my full-time job, came home, worked on this a couple hours, and then took up half my weekend. And we're essentially where, when I was working two jobs, Saturdays were pretty much the only time I had a decent amount of free time. And I might even check in on some of the work on Saturday, but basically Sunday through Friday were consumed from work. I didn't have much of a social life. I tried to still keep it, like I said, Saturday, Friday nights. I still tried to go and do things to try and not. You don't want to get to the point where, even if it is your dream, that you go so far that you burn yourself out and hate it. That goes the opposite direction. But it's just that, look, people come home from work and work out all the time. People come home from work and spend hours playing video games or spending TV. I know everybody always says there's only so many hours in a day, and I certainly feel that every football season as much as you or anybody else does. But at the same time, if you want to do this, you can make time. What it comes down to is when you said the second part of, did I think it was going to be a full-time job? Again, that was my ultimate goal, and I always like to hit my goals, but the realistic side of it was this might never happen. It might just be a side hobby. And that actually came down to when the deli closed because it didn't work out. I called the company I was working for and I said, I'm at a crossroads here. I don't have the deli anymore. Like, I can't keep doing this for $500 a month. It's either you hire me full time, or I'm going to have to go back to finding a quote unquote real business job and maybe do this on the side. But after 6 years, it's got to be one or the other. So it was, like I said, it was always an idealistic goal. It can be done. But I also consider myself extremely fortunate. I would not say without a connection with Tristan Cockcroft and actually Casey Joyner too, and Scott Engel being willing to bring me on. Without that, I could have been just another name that got swept under and eventually burnt myself out in 8 years.
I think it's a fascinating story, and I think it's super interesting because, I mean, you hear of all these people getting into, we've talked to a lot of sports broadcasters and whatnot, and it's kind of more of a set thing. But the fantasy industry, it's kind of like you said, like there were 6-7 years where you weren't getting paid. You weren't, it was just, you were doing it for fun because you loved it. And I think that's super interesting. And I think it's truly like an industry like none other. I mean, that's kind of crazy when you think about it.
Absolutely. And I will say the last part of that, and this is the toughest part because there's no set way to go about it. But the connections, I tell people this all the time too. When we go to the fantasy sports conference and stuff like that, or just out in general meeting places where like there's people around in the industry for other events and stuff like that, the first person I always introduce him to is my boss, Nando DeFino, because he's one of the most well-connected and most willing to help people out guys in the industry. The connections are going to be everything. I'm sure this doesn't surprise anybody, but it's the same thing you see in sports with coaches getting hired. It's the same thing you see in Hollywood with people getting jobs. I mean, how many times has J.J. Abrams rehashed the same, actors and actresses that work for him? It's the connections will matter. And I can see people out there who's like, man, I think this guy should get a shot or this girl should get a shot. And somebody else does that you just seen is like, well, it's because they worked together previously. And that's unfortunate, but you're not prohibited from making those same connections through social media, showing up at the events and just kind of getting yourself out there. You can never make enough connections. There's no such thing as too many connections.
Yeah. So I guess with that was a lot on your career and how you got here. So now I guess we can move over to actual fantasy football. And this is probably a question you'll hear a lot, like a sleeper kind of question. So what player or players who maybe have a little bit of a later round value right now could start climbing up boards as we get closer to the season starting?
Well, I think the obvious one right now is the one that kind of got thrown out already because he's ahead of everybody else in the backfield with Trey Sermon, the running back for the 49ers. But if you go back to what I wrote about during the draft time, this comes down to, I thought this was a potential anyway. I'd still say if Raheem Mostert is healthy from week 1, it's his job first. But what do we know about Kyle Shanahan is he made Jeff Wilson relevant. And if you take Jeff Wilson, the player, he's replaceable. He's waiver replaceable in the NFL, as in you can find a running back that does what he does on any team. But Shanahan has the Midas touch when it comes to running backs. Yeah. So if you get the starting running back, and in my opinion, Trey Sermon being the most talented running back in that backfield as soon as they drafted him, no question about it, better than Raheem Mostert. I thought it was only going to be a time before Sermon had that job. So if Mostert is ready for week 1, it'll be his, but I think you'll see some split with Sermon, and I wouldn't be surprised if Sermon takes over before then. And then, I'll tell you the one that got crushed. I'm really upset about this one. I was super excited for Josh Reynolds until the Titans traded for Julio Jones, because I was like, hey, they have nobody at number 2, and they just lost Corey Davis in free agency, and everything's telling me that they're going to be using Josh Reynolds, and they trade for Julio Jones. So let's go back to Atlanta and go for their old team. Everybody knows Russell Gage, obviously. He already had 110 targets last year. He should do the exact same this year. But if you're talking super, super deep now, if you're talking last round, he might not even get drafted in your average. He's probably not getting drafted in your average league, but the Falcons will run a lot of 2 tight ends because of Hayden Hurst is there. But when they're running 3 wide receivers, Olamide Zaccheaus is a really nice slot wide receiver who, maybe if Russell Gage gets hurt or struggles to be the number 2, I think you see Zaccheaus pop up a couple times this year. But that's super. Now you're talking about probably even like a 14-team league or deep benches. So I gave you a super, super deep one there.
Definitely a deep one. I remember I think he had some games last year where he got in there scoring and whatnot. But I like the Trey Sermon pick is one that I think a lot of people definitely have to look out for. Speaking about the Falcons, though, obviously you mentioned the big Julio Jones trade, and that had honestly some major potential fantasy impact. So I guess starting with the Falcons, you mentioned obviously their depth at wide receiver, but looking at the top of the depth chart there, you got guys like Mike Davis, Calvin Ridley, Kyle Pitts. How do you think their fantasy stocks? Obviously, they've rose tremendously with this trade, but where do you think these kind of guys fall now in terms of like where they might end up falling in the draft?
Yeah, actually, Calvin Ridley didn't move much for me. He moved up 1 spot only because I had A.J. Brown 1 spot in front of him, and I moved A.J. Brown back with Julio Jones coming to Tennessee just because the targets go down. I think the biggest winner, and you've probably heard his name a million times already, and you just said is Kyle Pitts since the draft. Like, we all know in fantasy how rare it is for a tight end to produce as a rookie. There's no question about it. You have 4, is it 4 or 5 in the entire history of the NFL that have caught over 700 yards. The only one to have 1,000 is Mike Ditka, and that's a whole different era of football back then. But the last one is Evan Ingram, and the Giants were with that Odell Beckham. Sterling Shepard was getting banged up that year. Evan Ingram essentially turned into the number 1 receiver for that team. Jeremy Shockey for the Giants was another one that did it. And if you look at that team, I think that's the better one to look at, is that it was Shockey and Amani Tuber, and then behind them, the next closest was Ike Hilliard, way behind them. So you'll get the pushback of saying, well, Russell Gage is better than Ike Hilliard was for that offense. Well, also, that's not an offense that was throwing 620 times. Matt Ryan is going to throw 600, 620, maybe even 630 times. So that third piece does become relevant anyway. I mean, we might be talking about a fourth one, but Kyle Pitts getting 110, 120 targets, he's going to be pushing for that tier, I'd say right on the heels of the Darren Waller, George Kittle, right behind those two. Obviously, Travis Kelce, number one, but right behind those two. I would still take those two every single day, but I think he actually leapfrogs Mark Andrews in Baltimore, just because if you told me 110, 120 targets for Kyle Pitts, and you told me Darren Waller only got the same amount, like if you said they both get the same amount of targets heading into the next year, I know it might sound crazy, but as a rookie, I would probably go Kyle Pitts.
Kyle Pitts will be a monster for sure with the Falcons. But on the other hand, or for the other team in the Titans, you have Julio, you have AJ Brown, who you said you bumped down just slightly. But for Derrick Henry, a player who a lot of people are probably going to be taking 1, 2, 3 overall in their fantasy football drafts, how do you see his stock being taken now? Is he higher up? Is he lower now because of this trade? Where do you have him?
He's another one I didn't really move because everybody is talking about the 370 carries and being concerned about the workload from last year. Here's the issue with that is there's actually two is to push back for that is he's only had 2 years over 300 carries. It's not like he's been doing this 5 years in a row. It's like, oh my God, he's starting to break down. So that's one thing. And on the second side of it, he's not your every running back. He's not even, he's a freak of nature. And that's the truth about it. If Derrick Henry gets hurt this year, it's going to be because somebody tackled him the wrong way. It's not going to be because Derrick Henry carried the ball 370 times and he's worn down. That this isn't Todd Gurley's bone on bone knee situation with the degenerative condition. So I didn't really move him. I don't think he carries it 370 times. Then you drop him down to just over 300 and like similar like 310, 320, maybe up to 330, and still going to be a little bit touchdown reliant. But where you say overall, I think he's just in that next tier. You have Christian McCaffrey, Barkley, both of them coming off injuries, Dalvin Cook, Alvin Kamara, and Derrick Henry is right there. And of all those, you might even in a half-point PPR, you might even argue Derrick Henry is the safest just because of who he is. He's not going to, again, a freak injury is going to take him down, but outside of that, he's not going to not produce, even though I just threw out a double negative at you.
Yeah, well, you mentioned obviously those top 5 guys. It seems like those top 5 guys are pretty much the consensus top 5 with anyone, any expert's opinion. But looking at that next tier is where it kind of gets interesting. You got guys like Zeke Elliott, Jonathan Taylor. You got, there's a whole bunch of guys. You can start throwing in names like Cam Akers, DeAndre Swift. I mean, there's a ton of guys. So obviously there's the top 5 that seems to be pretty set in stone. What about this next group of guys? Who do you kind of have towards the top of that tier? And then what are some of those guys that you might try and potentially avoid in your draft?
Yeah, Jonathan Taylor would kick off the tier for me. Although I've been a staunch supporter of Ezekiel Elliott, even looking back at last year, and I'm not even talking about this recent week of the best shape ever. Yeah, everybody always looks like the best shape ever in the offseason. Yeah. We do this every year. I just look at the first 5 games of Dak Prescott last year, and I find it interesting that people will go, look at what CeeDee Lamb did as a rookie with Dak Prescott. Look at what Amari Cooper did with Dak Prescott. Everybody doesn't care about, well, how about Ezekiel Elliott, who was a top 3 running back through the first 5 weeks with Dak Prescott? So I'm in on Zeke. If you look at it, he was also banged up for a lot of the year, and the 2 weeks where he had 100% practice, that week he ran for 100 yards. So again, I'm not saying like, okay, he's going to run for 100 yards every single week, but somebody who was dealing with injuries, poor quarterback play, just a messed up offense that people weren't expecting. So I'm still in on him. I would throw Chubb, Akers. I'm a big J.K. Dobbins fan, Joe Mixon. I'd even throw the rookie Najee Harris in here. The one I'm concerned about that I would also throw in this group, but I haven't mentioned, it's Aaron Jones. It's the same reason I was concerned about Aaron Jones last year. Obviously, my concern was I would say overrated a little bit because of where he finished inside the top 5. But it comes back to he's touchdown dependent. He rushes for about 1,000 yards, and we don't know what's going on with Aaron Rodgers. And even so, A.J. Dillon in his second season, does he steal some of those touchdowns? Because if Aaron Jones is the exact same Aaron Jones, he's one of the most efficient running backs on a per-touch basis. But if you just take away a handful of touchdowns or a handful of touches, and he's already only rushing for 1,000 yards, I don't know that I can take him over Nick Chubb, who's even splitting carries in his situation. At least we know he's getting the volume every single week. Even Cam Akers in his second year, and I know there's certain questions like, well, is he going to be the guy? I believe so. I would just rather go with somebody who I know is going to touch the ball almost 20 times a week versus 13 to 15, who also might lose some touchdowns, who also has a quarterback situation we still don't know what's going on with.
Yep. So that pack situation is obviously very confusing. We're going to have to see how that plays out. So piggybacking off of that Packer situation, Devonta Adams, who a lot of people have him as the number one receiver in fantasy football. If Aaron Rodgers is there, I'm assuming he's going to be putting up the same numbers, well, similar numbers, and still remain as that number one wide receiver. But if Aaron Rodgers isn't there, how do you see things playing out for Devonta Adams?
I make an easy comparison. I brought this up about a month ago when this first started, or even maybe before that, because the draft's been that long ago. Yeah, so over a month ago, is Allen Robinson. That's where I would put him. I would put him right alongside Allen Robinson as a low end low end wide receiver one, who is going to still see volume, but it's going to be less efficient volume. And Allen Robinson has put up wide receiver one numbers with terrible quarterback play for most of his career. Everybody keeps joking about, oh, he's going to have the best quarterback he's ever played with every single year. So this is the best quarterback he's ever played with. But to be honest about it, certain wide receivers can do more than most, even with poor quarterback play. And it also comes down to volume. Yeah, I mean, yes, we're hoping that Amari Rodgers can finally bring something to the wide receivers, that Valdez-Scantling can somewhat rebound, that Lazard can somewhat be a thing again. Tanyan was supremely touchdown based. He's the one I'd be more concerned about, because without good quarterback play, the volume of his touchdowns drops, and now you're talking about a tight end that's not even going to come close. But I think Devonta Adams will be fine. But yeah, obviously that's a huge drop, because Devonta Adams with Rodgers is the easy. There's no debate. Everybody's putting him at number one. Mm-hmm. After that, I think he drops down to like DeAndre Hopkins, Keenan Allen, Allen Robinson. I think that's the range that he falls into. Still wide receiver one. He's just now at the back end of it.
So obviously the wide receiver position, it seems to be one of those positions that each year is kind of like, it seems like it's a sure thing, but it's not really a sure thing. I mean, you look at Michael Thomas last year, he really struggled, obviously was banged up and whatnot. So obviously we talked about Devonta Adams, but outside of him, what are some guys at the position that you do like, that you think will have good years? And then also some guys that you think are projected a little too high rather than when they should potentially go?
Yeah, I'll go back to Lamb. I think that Lamb could not only provide the fact that we see this every year. Nobody ever wants to draft two wide receivers from the same team, but Thielen and Justin Jefferson just did it, finished as ones together. Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf, although Lockett was very up and down. It can happen. It happens plenty. Tampa Bay guys 2 years ago. But I would say that Lamb can not only reach the wide receiver one territory, I wouldn't be shocked if he surpasses Amari Cooper this year. That's how good he is. I think people kind of forgot how good he was because of what happened with Dallas after Dak went down. So even if Dak doesn't throw quite as much as he would, that's an easy thing to say. Through the first 4 games, he's set a record for it. But even if he's just 4,500 yards and 30 touchdowns, I wouldn't be like I said, I wouldn't be surprised if Lamb is up there. I'm gonna go to San Francisco. Somebody, the Brandon Ayuk situation with not knowing with Deebo Samuel and how that target share is gonna go. What I said about Ayuk last year and why I like him more than Deebo coming back from injury is because I thought Ayuk was a little bit redundant in a way as a rookie, but with the upside for more because he can succeed and play outside more than Deebo Samuel can. So I think even though Kittle's healthy back this year, I would say that Ayuk is going to take that next step forward. And then I'll give you one more kind of in this range who I think is just still not getting enough love. And I continue, he's my Deontay is that Deontay Johnson, for people that don't realize, his 11 healthy games. And I say 11 because I'm talking about the 2 games where he left early and then also was playing through an injury. But the 11 healthy games, fantasy points per game, he was wide receiver 8. And that's with a poor Ben Roethlisberger last year. Everybody's talking about Juju Smith-Schuster bouncing back. Give me a healthy Deontay Johnson. And I think that people just didn't realize how good he is when healthy. That's the biggest question, is how healthy is he? But I'm 100% on him. On the flip side of it, I'm kind of down on the entire Carolina guys being able to repeat what they did last year, even with Curtis Samuel gone. just because Christian McCaffrey is back, and Christian McCaffrey is going to command his 90 receptions. So, I still like DJ Moore. I'm just not going to take him near a wide receiver 1 territory. And then the other one, bring up the Giants here, is that I don't think Kenny Golladay is going to be able to repeat what he did with the Lions, even if he's healthy, just because Daniel Jones has so many weapons. But also Daniel Jones hasn't shown the confidence to throw into coverage. And Kenny Golladay is somebody that you have to throw even while he's covered because he can win those balls. Similar to Des Bryant, to go back to the Cowboys. But until Daniel Jones shows me that he's comfortable making those throws, I think Kenny Golladay could be hurt by his signing with the Giants.
Yep. So you spoke a little bit about the Cowboys. They obviously have that all-around talent: CeeDee Lamb, Amari Cooper, Michael Gallup, Ezekiel Elliott, and there are a bunch of teams like this, including the Browns when you spoke on Nick Chubb. But are there any teams in the league, because of their all-around talent on offense, that you want to avoid some players from, as you said, with the Panthers, that you may not want to be as high on DJ Moore because of Christian McCaffrey coming back? Are there any other teams that you're trying to avoid a certain position group from?
I would say avoid never 100% at cost, but the Jets come to mind for their wide receivers just because who do we know at this point? Obviously, things can clear up by the time we get to August. There's been a report that the Jamison Crowder reworking of his deal was to potentially set up a trade, but we have to take of what we have today is that he's still there. There was a lot of assumptions that they were just going to outright cut him because they would have saved over $10 million. I thought they were going to, but at this point, with Jamison Crowder still around, we've seen there's another guy who stays healthy. Jamison Crowder has been productive, extremely productive, but he's there, which kind of caps Elijah Moore and Denzel Mims just from him being there. Corey Davis, I think, fits better as a 1B, and that's why he broke out last year with A.J. Brown. I don't think he can necessarily handle getting top coverage from like a Stephon Gilmore and being out there every single week, especially with a rookie quarterback in Zach Wilson. I don't think he's going to have a bad season, but I could see him replicating last year's numbers with more targets, as in being less efficient. So Corey Davis, Jamison Crowder, Elijah Moore, the rookie. Jamison Crowder would probably be the one I like the best right now because he's going the cheapest, but he might not be on the team. And then Mims is not getting any positive praise so far. And that's even before bringing up the Keelan Cole signing, who's been running with the number ones, which always a great assault because you have to run with the number ones if you're going to get evaluated by a team. But when Mims is already running with the 2s, that's concerning for Mims, let alone the fact that they want to play Cole outside and potentially play that's just a mess. I'm avoiding as much as possible except for the cheapest cost. And right now the cheapest cost is Jamison Crowder.
I think that's an interesting point. Speaking on the Jets, though, running back is one of those positions, and specifically, I believe it was their 3rd round pick, Michael Carter, that a lot of people potentially like, including myself. I feel like that could be a decent value pick. So I guess, what are your thoughts on the Jets running back situation? If you do like Michael Carter, obviously they have Tevin Coleman there, but it seems like Michael Carter could have a really big chance to get some serious level of touches.
Oh, 100%. I am a Michael Carter fan. I actually put him in tier 2 of my running backs for pre-draft, right alongside Javonte Williams. And I said a lot of people didn't realize how good Michael Carter was because Javonte Williams kind of overshadowed him. And my way too early, right after the draft rankings, obviously this would change if the reports out of Denver are true and that Williams could get the job by day 1. But I'm bringing this up for the point. My initial, immediately after the NFL draft rankings, I put Carter in front of Williams because I thought Williams might take 6, 7, 8 weeks, kind of like Miles Sanders' rookie season a few years ago, before he had the job. I think Michael Carter does have the job from day 1. He is by far the most talented running back. The difference between the two, obviously, is Michael Carter kind of falls into the Austin Eckler range where, it's 14 to 17 touches a week, a decent amount in the passing game, which makes him extremely valuable in half a full point PPR like everybody plays these days. But he's never going to be a bell cow running back, and he doesn't need to be. And some running backs go back to Aaron Jones. Aaron Jones is another good comparison. The two of them, they could get 16 touches every single week. You put Michael Carter and Aaron Jones roll on the Packers with Aaron Rodgers, and we're probably talking about as a potential RB1. But for now, he's an RB3. I put him at the high end just because also it's the uncertainty right now. But I like that call. I'm a huge Michael Carter fan. I was actually going to bring him up earlier, but I'm glad, because we got kind of talking about some other stuff. I'm glad you brought him up because I love always trying to get him into any show I can.
Yep. So you spoke about a comparison to Austin Eckler. And going to that Chargers team, Justin Herbert, he's looking to take that next step this year as a quarterback. And I believe that there is a chance he could go as far as being the MVP in the NFL next year. So I want to ask you your thoughts on Justin Herbert, where he could end up in fantasy, and then even in real life, what he could end up doing.
Yeah, I'm a little bit more worried about Justin Herbert because it's going to come down to him. And I'm not saying he can't do it, but this is so. I'm going to bring Jared Goff into this conversation, and I'm not calling him Jared Goff. I think he's better than Jared Goff, to be clear.
Yeah.
But Jared Goff, a few years ago, Emery Hunt, a scout that I've talked to and worked with in the past, he pointed it out to me because he's like the upper echelon of all scouts out there that I ever know. But he pointed out, like, Jared Goff, the year that he started to falter was the year defense has figured out if you wait till the headset clicks off, and this is what Emery pointed out to me. And he said, watch the game. He's like, watch this, watch what happens. The headset clicks off when McVay couldn't talk to him anymore. And that's when the defense got into full formation. They kind of disguised it. They would kind of semi-line up and start moving around and kind of hide it. And then when the headset clicked off, they're like, well, Jared Goff doesn't know how to adjust to our defense. So we'll move around and get into our real spots. We'll get into our real assignments, whether it's zone, whether it's man, whether we're covering this guy, dropping down, whatever it might be, showing a blitz here, because Goff can't do that. So I bring that into this conversation to say this. Again, I think he's better than Goff. And we've seen that since that day, Goff has been not miserable, but pretty close to it. Justin Herbert, the last few games of the season, started to hit some bumps, and that's expected. He's a rookie. But the NFL is getting a book on him, and the NFL is starting to figure out this is where we bait Justin Herbert. This is where we find the holes in his game. He far exceeded anybody's expectation, especially mine. I was legitimately concerned about Herbert coming out of college. I'll even admit that. I was too low on him. I thought 3 years of not improving at Oregon against poor play, why are you going to do better in the NFL? And so far exceeded my expectations. If we see that same development jumping from college to the NFL to see in year 2 where it's now on him to say, I got to adjust back, absolutely. He's got the offense around him. They've improved the offensive line, which is a major question mark. You have the Rodgers situation, the Watson situation, which knocks 2 guys out of fantasy, where now you're talking about Justin Herbert could push the top 5. And then the AFC side, I mean, that's still every bet out there would be on Patrick Mahomes and probably Josh Allen second. But if anything were to go sideways for those guys, I think he could push himself into the conversation for your point, but it's going to be on his shoulders. That's what it comes down to. Are you the Justin Herbert that didn't improve in Oregon, or are you the Justin Herbert that we saw as a rookie? And if he's the Justin Herbert we saw as a rookie, he will be able to take that next step forward.
It's definitely going to be interesting to see. I know me and Mac both in our initial projections, or I guess tier list or whatnot, we had Justin Herbert pretty high. So it should be pretty interesting. But staying on the point of quarterbacks, obviously seems to be the main discussion. You brought it up yourself. The Aaron Rodgers, Deshaun Watson sagas, their trade requests. Who knows what the situation is with those guys? Obviously, it's June right now. So we're obviously going to know a little closer, and when drafts actually start happening, probably what the situation is going to be. But that said, with all this uncertainty right now, how do you have this quarterback situation shaping out in terms of how you rank these guys? Obviously, it seems like Mahomes and Josh Allen are pretty much the top 2. But how do you have, kind of the quarterback rankings playing out right now?
Yeah, I would go Murray, Dak, and Lamar as the top 5. Those are the easy top 5 for me. I think there's a question as soon as you get to Rodgers at 6. Rodgers can finish higher, and I have Rodgers at 6 as, like, even if he does get a trade, he'll be Aaron Rodgers. We're not so much concerned about Aaron Rodgers as we are the effect of what happens, as you mentioned earlier in the show, is what happens to Devonta Adams and the rest of the Packers with no Aaron Rodgers. So Aaron Rodgers, I'm not worried about. The Deshaun Watson situation, I think we're getting to the point, like, I don't know if he's draftable. And if he is, he's your second quarterback now. Like, you're not drafting him as your first. You're drafting him kind of in that conversation of, like, okay, can Daniel Jones rediscover what we saw 2 years ago and had hope for in 2020? Do we think that Carson Wentz can rebound in Indianapolis? Like, that's where Deshaun Watson's going now at this point, because it's not talent. It's, 1, is he even playing? And then 2, if he is even playing, is he even playing for Houston? So that has a ripple effect for Houston. I think as of today, for the Houston guys, you kind of have to treat them as if there is no Deshaun Watson. So it's Tyrod Taylor at quarterback, and Tyrod Taylor is a step down. We know that as a passing game wise, but I think Brandon Cooks will still be Brandon Cooks to a degree. It just comes down to who else is going to get opportunities. Is it going to be the rookie Collins? Is it going to be anybody else that can throw on the field. And that's why I say Collins, because Collins has a nice leg up to be able to jump in there and be the number 2 from day one. Similar to Justin Jefferson last year for the Vikings, that kind of situation in front of him. But how good is the quarterback play going to be? So yeah, I'm still taking Rodgers fine. I'd still go Rodgers over Wilson and Herbert if you wanted to take those guys. I wouldn't say you're nuts to do so, but again, that's because I think Rodgers is fine no matter where he is. Like I said, for Watson, he has to be towards the end of your drafts at this point.
Yep, I completely agree. I think those top 5, 6-ish type of quarterbacks are basically set at this point. But the next question I have is, what popular fantasy opinions or projected draft trends do you disagree with and encourage others not to follow?
You're trying to bait me into everything going on about zero running back right now. So I will easily go there. I've never been a zero running back person, mostly because I understand. I'm not stupid. I understand the point and the theory behind it, and I understand how it works. And if you were the only person in your league to do it, it definitely can work. I've seen it work. But the problem there's twofold here. The problem with zero RB is, look at last year, look at how many running backs we were chasing in week 13 of, the Savant Ahmeds and the Samaje P. Ryans and those guys of the world, where it's like, oh my God, I got to find a second running back if I'm going to make the playoffs. I got to find a second running back to try and make it through the playoffs. Injuries happen, things happen in the NFL. There's bust up and down the line. And I know everybody's like, well, look at how many running backs bust. But that number is kind of inflated and offset, because it's, look how many first round running backs are bust. Well, there's also 9, 10, 11 of the first round picks are running backs. So there's going to be more. Yes, wide receiver is safer, but wide receiver's super replaceable. I mean, we're talking about the fact that this year you're looking at ADPs where Jarvis Landry isn't even inside the top 40 anymore. One of the most consistent wide receivers of the past however many years isn't even going inside the top 40 anymore. You have guys like Michael Gallup, you guys mentioned before when we were talking about the Cowboys. You had the Jerry Jeudy rookies, and they're going to their second year, potentially breaking through, and out there in a better situation with Cortland Sutton, his situation. Those type of guys, Antonio Brown, Devontae Parker. I mean, like, there's just names down there where it's ridiculous. So I've been always bell cow running back. And what that means to me, and probably similar to most people, is that out of the first 2 rounds, I want to get one bell cow, one guy. He doesn't have to touch the ball 20 times a week, because Austin Eckler is a bell cow fantasy running back. I want somebody I know every single week, his floor is probably around 10 or 12 points. That's bell cow to me, because I know every single week I can rely on you, and every single week you have the upside for 20 plus points. So I need to come out of the first 2 rounds with one of those, and then grab another running back before I get to like round 6, because I don't want to be chasing those running backs. Because to go back to the zero RB and why it only works if you're the only person is because it relies on you hitting on those running backs who are backups to come through, but also the waiver wire. And the problem is, as soon as there's a second or third team there with you doing it, they're chasing the same guys you are in the waiver wire. And you want to talk about hit rates? Let's talk about the fact that the hit rates on the waiver wire are usually about 10 to 20%. So now you take that and you're trying to divvy it up across 2 or 3 teams doing the exact same thing, potentially not winning the waiver bids and potentially being the wrong running back that you picked, because there's no guarantee. Because who was the one for the Broncos a couple years? Oh God, I can't remember his name right now. There's one for the Broncos like 3 years ago, and everybody's swearing up and down he was going to be the replacement when somebody got hurt. And the very next week, wasn't him. It was somebody else altogether. So like, those things can happen. So that's why I do understand the theory behind it, but in my opinion, it doesn't work unless you're the only person. And I'm not going to play that game and risk that. I hope I'm the only person in my draft thinking this way.
For sure. I mean, you kind of spoke on it a little bit with your running back strategy, how you like to get guys at least 2 before the first 6 rounds. And I feel like this year, just, initially doing some mock drafts, seems like that's kind of where all the real, starters are going to fall. You're really going to have to start, like you said, relying on backups, which you never want to do. But in terms of the other positions, obviously you've got the quarterback position, wide receiver, which is, like you said, I mean, you can get a really quality late receiver in some of these later rounds. It's kind of crazy. Tight end's a very weird position. So how do you kind of map out the rest of your draft process? Where do you like taking specific position groups? So kind of just explain your thought process when drafting.
Yeah, it's always going to be how the draft falls to you, because I answer this question a lot every single year. There's always like, who should I target in round 2? All right, when my first 2 picks are this, who should I get in round 3? And I would say, like, don't go in with a preset strategy. You just never know how the draft is going to fall. I mean, you could say, who should I take with the number 2 pick? And I could tell you, go get Dalvin Cook. Well, what if the first person takes Saquon Barkley and you still go Dalvin Cook? That was a dumb move. Like, you just never know. And I've seen drafts where Christian McCaffrey doesn't go with the number 1 pick. So I say, like, take it with, this is my strategy, but don't go in and not be flexible. That's actually my top strategy, is be flexible to the draft. The best value on the board is often the best pick. But I'm going to, especially this year, try to come out of the first 3 rounds with 2 running backs. Because of what you talked about, especially if you're watching the mocks. And again, I've seen 10, 11 running backs are going in round 1, because the dead zone for running backs, and I forget who, so credit to the people out there, and people will probably tweet and be able to mention it. I forget who the person was, but they mentioned a dead zone for running backs is like the 4th or 5th round. And they're right. Every single year, that 4th, 5th, and even the 6th round, you start chasing the guys like Tevin Coleman. Like, let's say the news report today was Tevin Coleman has the lead, Carter has to beat him out. Tevin Coleman would probably go around the 5th, 6th round if we got that report today. And it ends up like, all right, he doesn't even have the job. And even when he did, he wasn't that good. It's just a dead area. But meanwhile, in that 5th round, you don't even have to talk about the guys we were talking about, either a wide receiver. You're talking on the 5th round that Thielen and Cooper Kupp and Odell Beckham, if he's 100%, like, those wide receivers are still there in the 5th round. Those are guys who not only are lock solid wide receiver 2s, but that could finish as wide receiver 1s. So I'm going to try and come out with 2 running backs of the first 3. Tight end, I'm never the guy to take a tight end in the first round, but if Kelsey's there like middle to late 2nd, I'll do it. If Kittle and Waller kind of get into the 4th round, I'll think about it. But that doesn't usually happen in most drafts. But if they're there, I will. I usually like to wait on tight end and like go for the breakout guys like we saw from last year, and like similar to this year's, like Adam Trotman, who I love this year as a potential breakout, but he's completely undrafted right now. But you can fight tight ends late. Quarterback, everybody knows to wait at quarterback, but at some point there's a breaking spot for that. Like, I'm not taking Patrick Mahomes in the 2nd round. Patrick Mahomes is there in the 4th. I don't want to do it, but I'm going to do it every single time. I tweeted this out 2 weeks ago. You're going to keep giving me Lamar Jackson in the 6th round? I'm going to do it every single time. I don't want to take him there, because everybody knows you can wait on quarterbacks and get top 10 quarterbacks at the end of your drafts. But at some point, the value outweighs the strategy. And that's what I wanted to circle back to as the final point. Let the value dictate your draft.
Yep, I think letting the value dictate the draft is a great way to draft. And as you both said, getting a running back early is going to be very, very important in this year's fantasy football drafts. But I guess with that, we could wrap things up here on Outside the Arena. Thank you, Jake, for coming on and speaking with us. We really appreciate that. And everyone, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, not only on this channel, but on our 2nd channel, OTA Clips. We just posted some Julio Jones content over there about 2 weeks ago. If you guys want to check that out, make sure to follow us all on Instagram. That'll be the best way to reach out to us. My Instagram is mac.rommel. Griffin's Instagram is
Griffin Senick.
And our podcast Instagram is Outside the Arena Podcast. So feel free to reach out to us there. We will link all of Jake's social medias down in the description below. And as always, stay safe, and we'll see you all next week on Outside the Arena.